Welcome everyone to our webinar today. Grateful that you've joined us. We have around 200 registered for this webinar, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes as everyone files in, and we'll kick off very shortly. So we're excited to be able to bring this this report into everyone's awareness today. It's been a fantastic journey getting here, and looking forward to the conversation and being able to share the findings and the journey we've been on. So again, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. Just continue to wait as people start filing in. See the number of participants slowly but surely growing. We'll kick off in about a minute's time. About 220 registered for the webinar, so expecting to be, not everyone will be able to join, but we are recording the webinar today, and it'll be made available on the Aotearoa Circle website for people to be able to view afterwards. So certainly the report will be made available for any and all to be able to read and digest at their leisure, again on the Aotearoa Circle website. So we'll just give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll kick off into the webinar. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Mark Fitzpatrick, toko ingoa, ko taku mahi ki Aotearoa Circle, ko te Implementation Director. Welcome everyone to this webinar today to share with you the latest report published by the Aotearoa Circle, Energy Sector Climate Change Scenarios. Really appreciate you being with us. Your questions are welcome at any time throughout the webinar. We're going to be joined by some fascinating guests who will all get a chance to address those questions near the end. Let me introduce our guests immediately. So to give us an overview of the report, we'll be joined by PwC partner and co-author Annabelle Chartres, and also co-author James Ayling, PwC Senior Manager, and Hunter Douglas, Climate Scientist from PwC. After that, we have a panel of sector experts who contributed to this report. So welcome Callum McLean, Senior Policy and Government Affairs Advisor at Claris, formerly First Gas Group, Tina Frew, Head of Sustainability, Meridian, John Duffy, Business Director, Energy Advisory at Becker, and again, Annabelle Chartres, partner at PwC, will also be with us as part of the panel. As I said before, the report itself will be made live on our website from the end of this webinar. Let me kick things off with some context about why we undertook this work. Firstly, and clearly, the energy sector is vital to Aotearoa's prosperity and our ability to function. As the report itself says, the energy sector plays an essential role in Aotearoa, New Zealand, supporting all facets of our daily lives and well-being, empowering future generations. The delivery of secure, affordable, and low-carbon energy is also critical for successful emissions reduction across all other sectors. Secondly, climate scenarios work is something that the Aotearoa Circle has commissioned for other sectors. These include the agri sector, tourism sector, and seafood sector. So why have we done all this work? Well, it starts with our purpose as an organisation. Our purpose is to restore Aotearoa's natural capital for future generations. The Aotearoa Circle is a leadership organisation made up of around 50 partners, New Zealand organisations from the public and private sectors working together to restore Aotearoa's natural capital. And we do that at a systems level, which is the level at which these climate change scenarios fit. Creating climate change scenarios helps in two ways. Firstly, they help New Zealand organisations to meet their climate reporting obligations. As well as doing their own individual scenarios, the XRB has recommended that sectors come together to work on scenarios for sectors. And beyond just doing the right thing from a reporting point of view, Aotearoa's external reporting board, the XRB, says scenarios encourage entities to focus on the bigger picture, to get the most out of the process and move beyond solely focusing on reporting or compliance. Fundamentally, these scenarios make us think. They help us plan for an uncertain future. They enable businesses and other organisations to prepare themselves for and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. They can also motivate businesses and other stakeholders to strengthen their efforts to address climate change. So with all those good things in mind, I want to hand over to three of the report's co-authors, Annabelle Charteris, PwC partner, James Ayling, PwC senior manager, and Hunter Douglas, climate scientist from PwC. Annabelle, James, and Hunter, before you start, can I thank you and the entire team at PwC? We at The Circle just want to acknowledge how hard you worked to bring all this together. You acted as secretariat, you offer climate change expertise, project coordination, stakeholder management, workshop facilitation, reporting, and documentation. A huge number of hours have gone into this work, and we are so grateful. Now's a good time to also say a huge thank you to the working group and the leadership group who did the hard yards on this work stream. The members are far too many to name, but we're grateful for your expertise and thoughtfulness. We know this work can make a difference for the whole sector. So thank you. Annabelle, James, and Hunter, over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Wonderful to be here today. As you rightly said, this has been a huge project and a huge commitment, not just by us, but by all of the participants involved in this process. And in opening, I'd just like to say it's been such a privilege to work with so many organisations across the energy sector in developing this report. This has been a really significant collaborative effort, and I thank you all for your generous commitment of time, insights, specialist knowledge, and challenge throughout the course of this project. I also wanted to call out that in addition to James and Hunter, who will present alongside me today, this work from a PwC side couldn't have been completed without the tireless efforts of Phoebe McCarty and Isla Christensen, who are also part of the PwC team. In terms of what we'll do today, I'm going to give a brief overview over the next 20 minutes at least. I'll give a brief overview of the context and objectives of the project. James will then take over and explain how this report can be used and the process we've gone through to arrive at this output today. And then Hunter, as our resident climate scientist, will dive into the detail of the scenarios themselves and where we've actually landed for the sector in terms of building those out. So if we move through, thanks, Hunter, to looking first at the challenges and opportunities. It goes without saying that for Aotearoa's energy sector, there are many, many risks and many, many opportunities that exist. They are not necessarily unique, all of them, to the sector itself, but is certainly something that needs to be faced into. From a challenges perspective, Aotearoa New Zealand's energy sector assets are already and will continue to be exposed to increasing physical and transitional climate risks, and that includes regulatory pressures to decarbonise. In addition, each of the three elements of the energy trilemma, which many of you will be familiar with, so security, sustainability, and affordability, will continually be challenged in the future. That is not going to change, and the importance of those three elements remains and getting the balance right. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, their reports continually make for some pretty grim reading. The situation is not improving for our planet, and they keep telling us that we need rapid and deep emissions reductions across all sectors around the world. And the energy sector really has a critical and central role to play in achieving this, not only in Aotearoa, but certainly around the world as well. And then from an Aotearoa New Zealand perspective, our resilience, our future resilience is really, really critically dependent on a thriving and efficient energy sector. Turning to opportunities, it goes without saying that the delivery of secure, affordable, and low carbon energy is absolutely critical for successful emissions reductions across all other sectors that function in our economy. This creates a huge opportunity for those that can support this need in the future. And given how essential energy is to the prosperity and well-being of the country and and the economy. The sector has a real opportunity to lead and influence others through its decisions and actions. And then finally, in some respects, many parts of the energy sector, more so than perhaps other sectors in our economy, are already well versed in evaluating the risks of climate change and using scenario analysis for strategic decision making at an entity level. However, sector level analysis of the type that we've developed here enables us to take into consideration the energy sector ecosystem as a whole and how the implications of climate change might play out on different parts of that ecosystem under different scenarios in the future. Next slide. Turning now to what we were seeking to achieve out of this project when you consider those challenges and opportunities that the sector faces. We've sought to explore how climate change could affect the sector and through the process of developing sector-level climate change scenarios. In doing that, the first objective has been to translate the climate science into challenging and plausible climate change scenarios, developing a set of scenarios that reflect a range of plausible pathways for the energy sector in Aotearoa. These scenarios have been co-developed with sector participants by looking at the key risks, opportunities, uncertainties, and driving forces that the sector could face in the future. The second objective has been to give visibility to the potential impacts of climate change across the energy sector value chain by collating and articulating those potential impacts, which is what the report sets out to do. And now I'll pass to James to take us into a bit more detail of the process we've been through.
Awesome, thank you, Annabelle. And kia ora, Mark, thank you for your kind opening words. So kia ora koutou, called James Ailing Tokuingawa. I'm a senior manager here in PwC Sustainability, Climate and Nature Practice, and myself, along with the wider PwC team, has had the great opportunity to act as secretariat in development of these scenarios, and it's been our absolute pleasure to be involved in this really important piece of work. I just want to quickly start by saying a big thank you to all the participants involved, also to the broader PwC team who are extremely dedicated to driving great outcomes for this project. And of course, the Aotearoa Circle for leaning into this challenge and initiating the development of these scenarios. Awesome, so Mark briefly touched on it, but I just want to kind of kick off starting on why climate change scenarios are a thing and how they can really be used. So climate scenarios allow us to give structure to what sometimes is a really uncertain future. However, rather than trying to predict a future, what we can do is paint broad pictures of how the future could plausibly look. And in doing so, we create a bit of a canvas from which we can assess and analyze organizational resilience. Essentially, scenarios allow us to consider beyond the business as usual assumptions. And once we develop them, they become really useful tools. So the insights we gain during the process of engaging with them supports strategic decision-making, risk management, and long-term planning across organizations. So they're extremely critical. From an external perspective, scenarios often help meet climate reporting requirements, such as the ones we have here in New Zealand with the Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. But they also give investors and wider stakeholders kind of confidence that an organization is considering and planning for the challenge of climate change. As an entity from an internal perspective, they can also be used to assess how an organization might be tracking to meet climate change goals and also provide and assist with a better understanding of risk and opportunity through the organization. Personally, I do like to think of climate change scenarios as kind of the mindset we all need to take on one of the biggest challenges we face. So I encourage you all to consume them as much as you can. So now that we've got our sector level scenarios, how do we use the sector level scenarios in entity disclosures? So sector level scenarios can be a really handy tool for entity level. As Mark mentioned, the XRB suggested, on next slide please, Hunter. XRB suggested that sectors come together to develop scenarios at a sector level. And the benefit of doing this is that then we can come from a starting point and some common ground to work from as entities then go and develop their own work. For example, these sector scenarios have already done the hard, heavy lifting when it comes to thinking about global and New Zealand data reference points and matching those to particular scenarios. So if you don't know where to start with the SSPs and RCPs, and I'm throwing a bit of jargon in there intentionally, then these sector scenarios can really help you. But it's important to hold them lightly because they're not the answer. Instead of thinking they're the answer, think of them as a reference point to stimulate further thinking and really tailored scenarios at your NGD level. They shouldn't really be adopted in full. I definitely discourage you from doing that, but elements of the scenarios can of course be included, excluded, combined, adjusted, or augmented to each organization's own purpose and needs. And as Annabelle mentioned, I know many of the energy sector entities have already constructed their own scenarios, and these scenarios, the sector ones, will provide an additional resource to be used for, that can be used in future analysis and reporting. And just finally, beyond the regulatory realm, these scenarios can also benefit other organizations that are considering adopting the climate scenarios process as a really, really useful critical thinking tool. Awesome. Next slide, please, Hunter. Let's skip through to the next one. So I just want to touch on the governance structure and the participation we had across this project. So the Aotearoa Circle kicked off the project, inviting participants from across the sector to be involved. You can see a list of organisations on screen there. I'm not going to run through them in detail. And of course, we couldn't capture every organisation in the energy sector. That just probably wouldn't be plausible. But as we developed these scenarios, we did make sure that we were thinking broadly across the wide range of sector components and beyond just the remits of the organisations involved in the process. The governance structure was based around two groups, and firstly we had the leadership group. This group provided governance and oversight of the project. It basically set the ambition as well as challenged, guided and reviewed the work on the way through. We then had the working group, and this group included experts from across the energy sector, coming from a wide range of roles and positions. And these people were really engaged in workshops and provided their really useful insights and analysis. And then finally, PwC acted as the secretariat, offering climate change expertise, project management, stakeholder coordination, and workshop facilitation, as well as documentation. So it seems like a long time, and I think it kind of does feel like that. But the approach we followed for these sector scenarios was based around XRB's guidance and best practice for developing them. This approach allowed us to gain insights and for collaboration to take place among the participants. And we developed them through a series of workshops kicking off in September 23 and running through to February 24. And through this process, we developed a pretty comprehensive understanding of the most significant climate change risks, opportunities, driving forces, and potential impacts and outcomes for the sector. The process was really designed to kind of build on top of each other, and the insights were gained on a step-by-step process. And it all kind of came together in the scenarios that you will see today. And finally, I just want to touch on some of the collaboration which took place. As many of you may know, simultaneously to this project, the transport sector is developing their own set of climate change scenarios. And given the strong interdependencies and reliance these two sectors have on each other, it was really essential, we thought, for the participants of both groups to come together. So PwC, along with KPMG, who are leading the transport sector scenarios, organised 2 group working sessions where participants from both groups engaged in detailed discussions, and we focused on identifying and understanding the key linkages between future pathways of the energy and transport sectors. This cross-sector collaboration, I feel, really enriched the process, and it also helped in creating more realistic and actionable scenarios for addressing climate change. As users of the report, you might want to have a look at how the two sectors link up. So there is a section in both reports, noting that the transport report will be out next week, which basically outlines key assumptions that underpin the transport and energy sector level scenarios, highlighting areas of alignment and distinction. Awesome, so that's the process. I'm sure you want to get into the detail now, so I'm going to pass over to my colleague Hunter to take you through in more detail.
Kia ora. Great, thank you, James. Kia ora koutou, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Hunter Douglas, a climate scientist here at PwC, working with James, Annabelle, Phoebe, and the team on the scenarios. And just want to say what a privilege it's been working with the broader stakeholder group and getting the expert insights from our leadership and working groups. I've really enjoyed that process. So as has been touched on, the energy sector in Aotearoa is a really large and diverse one, right? So this slide here, it gives you just a bit of an indication of how we've been thinking about the breadth of the sector when setting the boundaries for what the sector does include. So on the fuel production side of things, fuel provision, I should say, that ranges everything from importation, production, transport, point of sale. On the electricity generation side of things, you've got, as I say, the generation, the transmission, distribution, also retail. So there's a lot of different companies and organizations working across the sector to all provide a single solution, right? They're united by this idea of providing Kiwis with energy. So lots of different ways you can do that, but we've had to include all of this in terms of defining our boundaries for the sector scenario analysis. And that's been a really helpful step to just set a shared understanding of what's included as we work through this report. So one of our, as Annabelle mentioned early on, the key objectives for these scenarios were to create narratives that are both plausible and challenging, and also to be really tailored to the energy sector so that they're useful for entities to implement in their own entity level scenario analysis. The challenge of making tailored scenarios to such a diverse sector means that we had to think creatively about what these scenarios ought to include and how to consider the kind of boundaries of challenges that and risks and opportunities that the sector could face. So to shape our thinking and how these scenarios come together and relate to one another, we started by broadly mapping these scenarios on an axis of physical and transition risk. This is what's known as the scenario matrix. It's part of the XRB recommended approach. And you can kind of see at a glance there that the scenarios are kind of clustered from your top left to your bottom right. There aren't any scenarios in that bottom left sector that would of low transition risk and low physical risk. That's a scenario essentially of if climate change wasn't happening, which sadly isn't the case. So not really plausible. And you're also not really seeing anything in that far upper right sector of high transition risk and high physical risk. That would be a scenario where, despite really strong efforts to combat climate change still ravages out of control. And scientific consensus is really that that is not a plausible scenario, that our actions will have effect. So indeed, our scenarios here are clustered along this kind of grouping of top left to bottom right, and that's those are the areas where effort in equals results out. So there's, I guess, a kind of encouraging message in that. So the scenarios, there are 4 of them, as you can see there. Coordinated effort. This is the scenario that's aligned with 1.5 degrees of global warming. And that's an XRB requirement. We'll get into the details of that. All the way up to the hothouse scenario, which is a scenario with more than 3 degrees of global warming. And you can see the graph on the right there of what global temperatures do under each of these 4 scenarios. And then there are 2 in the middle of that kind of moderate physical risk in the 2 to 2.5 degree global warming level. So those are the slow followers and the trailblazers scenarios. And another way we've been thinking about how these scenarios kind of cover that broad risk space and how they create unique challenges across all of them is to think about how New Zealand's efforts to decarbonize relate to the efforts of the rest of the globe. Because the energy sector is one where no matter what service you're provisioning, you're exposed to international developments, whether that's international markets such as oil prices, or whether that's developments in low emissions technology that are happening overseas. New Zealand's energy sector is really exposed to what's happening on the global stage. So the trailblazers and slow followers scenarios, as we'll see when we go through these all in a bit of detail, represent scenarios where New Zealand's efforts to decarbonize are out of step with what's happening around the rest of the globe. And there are unique challenges that arise as a result of that misalignment. So we can dive into each of these. First up, hothouse. So this is our scenario of more than 3 degrees of global warming. It's one where emissions continue to rise throughout the century. Essentially, it's a scenario where the tragedy of the commons outcome eventuates, and each country is taking a rather individualized approach to climate change, not seeing the benefits of reducing their own emissions and instead focusing on security and adaptation. So adapting to the reality that temperatures are going to continue to rise and physical hazards are going to continue to increase. So the risks are primarily manifest in a physical sense under this scenario, where rising temperatures continue to result in worsening physical hazards. There's less pressure on organizations to change their business as usual practices because there's not that kind of top-down approach to ensuring that emissions are reduced over time, and there's not really the benefits to be gained through doing so in this way. So while the transition risks may start off low, there are risks that arise later in the century, particularly with regards to things like access to finance and insurance. And again, as those markets are exposed to the physical hazards, you get volatility in prices coming in. So it's certainly not low risk through the entire time period, even from a transition point of view. The next scenario is the slow followers scenario. So this is one of those ones of kind of misaligned effort between New Zealand and the rest of the globe that I mentioned. This is where there's kind of moderate ambition to decarbonize around the world, but in particular, development nations and some of our major trading partners are pushing quite hard to reduce their emissions. But New Zealand, in contrast, is kind of taking a bare minimum, do what we only absolutely have to decarbonize. And that puts us a bit out of step with the rest of the world and introduces some transition risks around things like access to free trade agreements. And in particular, in this scenario, in the medium to long term, as overseas developments result in improvements to low emissions technologies, and these become dominant in overseas markets, these technologies then become the economically best option for a lot of New Zealand parts of the New Zealand energy sector, and there may be rapid and disruptive transitions happening in the New Zealand energy sector that are more economically driven, but still disruptive to organizations that have failed to plan for that. Global temperatures, as mentioned, are kind of in the around 2.5 degrees by the end of the century, what would call maybe a moderate physical risk relative to the other scenarios. So there's both transition and physical risks that are manifest under this scenario. The Trailblazers scenario is the other scenario where New Zealand's efforts are a bit out of step with the rest of the world. So while the rest of the world is taking a kind of moderate ambition to decarbonize, New Zealand is pushing hard and fast and really aiming for a 1.5 degree compliant emissions reduction pathway. And that is happening in the context of not all the developments that we'd like to see happening overseas in terms of alternatives for different technologies that are lower emissions. It means that the decarbonization in New Zealand is really driven by electrification of transport and industry, kind of using existing technologies. It's also a scenario where that transition is not terribly well coordinated or planned across the public and private sectors. So it's a highly disruptive transition to a low emissions economy, but one where that transition is achieved. So again, they're kind of moderate physical risks under the scenario, but high transition risks. Finally, we have our coordinated effort scenario, and this is one where New Zealand is also pushing hard to meet emissions reductions targets that are in line with 1.5 degree, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But so too is the rest of the world. So this is one where the pace of change is really rapid. There's technological developments that are happening overseas and filtering into the New Zealand markets. So the pathways to decarbonization for different parts of the sector can rely on a whole different range of technologies and approaches. Now, there's debate around the world around the kind of plausibility of whether or not we can hit this 1.5 degree target, but it's not only just a requirement of the XRB's standards to include a pathway consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming to capture that challenging but plausible outcome where we take rapid action to reduce emissions. It's also aligned with targets under the Net Zero Amendment to the Climate Change Act here in New Zealand. And it also captures that as mentioned, kind of plausible outcome where the pace of change is really rapid. We cross some social tipping points where there are feedback loops in terms of what consumer preferences are and what the costs of different alternative technologies are. So it is there from both the scientific and a kind of conceptual point of view, it's plausible and a future that really needs to be planned for. But it's also not a risk-free option, right? This is not like per se the everything goes well option. It would present significant challenges to any organizations that aren't prepared for that rate of change. So that takes us through our 4 scenarios. And as we've developed these narratives around what's happening both within New Zealand and around the globe, we've worked collaboratively with the leadership and working groups to understand what risks these scenarios face to the energy sector in New Zealand. And these are organized across physical and transitional risks. And there are also opportunities that arise, as Annabelle mentioned, that are really significant for the energy sector here. So in trying to think a bit through what are the most pertinent risks and opportunities for the sector under these scenarios, we've worked with the participants to arrange these by their impact and uncertainty. And risks that are both highly impactful and uncertain get pulled out as kind of key risks that are prioritized through the reporting process. And so we've reported on these risks, and while each of them may not apply in the same order to every organization, we think it captures some of the really key risks that organizations really ought to be considering, even if that consideration is just to say like, oh, that's not applicable to us. I think it presents a really useful planning tool for when it comes time to developing your own entity level scenarios. As James mentioned, it's not about taking all of this verbatim, but working through finding what's relevant and adapting it to your own needs. So that takes us through the risks and opportunities. I'll pass back to James to talk about next steps.
Awesome. Thank you, Hunter. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour of the report. So what next? That's a great question. So I'd encourage you all to go out and read the report. It's going to be available on the Aotearoa Circle website for download. I'd also encourage you to share it with some of your colleagues and other people across any sector, particularly the energy sector, because I think everyone should really have a bit of an interest in this report and others. And then you use it, have a read through, take some of the material, think about how it applies to your organizations and how your organization might be positioned in some of these future possible climate scenarios. Beyond that, please continue to I would encourage you to all to continue the awesome coordination and cooperation that you've been demonstrating. I think it's generally going to be what makes a difference as we face into this challenge. Awesome. So that's us. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Mark. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Annabelle, James and Hunter. Absolutely, collaboration, coordination is what's needed for this challenge that we all face. And it's an excellent piece of work. So thank you for your overview there. Look, a reminder to everyone here today, you're very welcome to post questions for our panel in the Q&A. So there should be a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to get to as many of those as we can at the end of our discussion. But up next, now we'd like to bring in our panel. So firstly, Callum McLean, Senior Policy and Government Affairs Advisor at Claris, formerly First Gas Group. Tina Frew, welcome, Head of Sustainability from Meridian. John Duffy, welcome, Business Director, Energy Advisory at Becca, and Annabelle's remaining with us, partner at PwC. So look, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today to have this discussion. Look, Annabelle, I'd like to come to you first, please. What do you see as the benefits from a report like this for organisations that aren't required to do these sorts of scenarios at the entity level?
Thanks for the question, Mark. I think in starting to answer it, I'm keen to reiterate what climate change scenario analysis is. We've got to remember that it's a strategic planning tool that we can use to understand the potential impacts of climate change. It's absolutely not the answer, but it's a really great way for an organisation to broaden its thinking and to consider what could happen in the future guided by clear scientific framing of the changes and the challenges we could face. So sector-level climate scenarios can be really useful to test an organization's resilience over a range of different time horizons in the future, and perhaps shine a light on risks or opportunities that might not have been considered using shorter-term time horizons or traditional strategic planning and risk assessment exercises. So it's another way of looking at the world in the future and what might eventuate. They'll always need to be tailored or tweaked a bit to the specific context of the organization that's using them. But they're really, really useful and a really good starting point to help navigate what is becoming an increasingly complex and uncertain future world for us all. So that's how I would suggest others beyond climate reporting entities could really leverage the information and the analysis that's gone into this report.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Annabelle. And obviously, look, coming to the other panelists, Callum, we'll start with you and then go to you, Tina, and then John. The report, a lot of it is about risks. What are the risks that stand out to you in the worst case warming scenario here, which in this report is the hothouse scenario? So Callum, coming to you first.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone's effort involved in this. And Annabelle's answer is actually quite relevant for us, since we're one of those organisations that isn't required to do climate reporting, but we choose to do so. And we have quite a range of energy businesses with a range of impacts. So we own First Light Network, which is the electricity distributor for Te Tairāwhiti and Wairoa. And that clearly has the biggest physical risks under the hothouse scenarios. So the above ground electricity infrastructure, poles and wires, that really does have some pretty significant risks, as we saw with Cyclone Gabrielle. Our experience there was that it was the unstable hillsides and the amount of flooding and the forestry slash in the flooding with the biggest impacts there. High wind events will remain a really significant impact for electricity distribution businesses, and the impact that vegetation can have on the poles and the wires. And then in terms of transition risks, the biggest risks are for our gas pipeline businesses. So the First Gas business. So there, it's definitely asset stranding is the key risk for those businesses. That's quite credible. We've seen research published by the Gas Infrastructure Futures Working Group that's shown that there's a clear lose-lose in terms of the doing nothing scenario, where businesses are incentivized to continue to invest, and there's just an unmanaged and disorderly wind down of the network. So that's the key ones for our businesses.
Thanks, Callum. And Tina, coming to you in the hothouse scenario, what risks stood out to you?
Kia ora, Mark. Yeah, well, I guess hothouse, the risk set is very dominated by the severe kind of physical risks, and that can point to the obvious things like damage and loss of access to energy systems. But I think it's interesting to note some of that kind of enabling infrastructure, roads and bridges, that could be something that could have a few impacts. And obviously to deliver the transition, we have some dependency and access to kind of offshore components and things like that. But I mean, I would say sort of looking at really the consequences of what those risks point to, I would hope that it would motivate most rational people to exercise their choice and unique influence to do what we can to not be going down that path. I would kind of lean into, obviously, and appropriately plan for what those what's pointed to there, but I'm probably more attracted to focusing on some of the big opportunities highlighted in this report, and there are many. So I'm glad to kind of see that it's pointing to the risks, but also the opportunities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And John, for you, what were the key risks in the hothouse?
Yeah, kia ora, thanks, Mark. Echo Tina's comments, really. I think national resilience and natural disasters and how what we're seeing now becomes more prevalent, increasing costs and protection in our response and our ability to respond. And what's increasingly likely to happen is those that are most vulnerable are likely to be the most affected. So that then just creates that widening inequity in the gap and increasing economic pressure, and probably also reinforces the distance that we are from the rest of the world. So, it's the scenario we don't want to be responding to, because it's very much worst case, and we'll see the challenges that we're facing now even more glaringly obvious and costly for all.
It's certainly a situation of being forced to plan for the worst and well, putting the effort into the best, aren't we? Look, staying with you, John, in this work, what were some of the more interesting challenges that you faced, given the sector makeup?
Yeah, thanks. I suppose I'm a relative newbie to the sector as well, so I felt like I was drinking from the fire hydrant, getting my head across the the complexity of not only the various parts of the system, but also the various technologies and the consequences of various policy and investment settings that we have now, let alone the ones that we could apply. I thought the process of Q&A that PwC led the group through was really good, similar to those that I've been involved with in other sectors. So that was reassuring. And I think for me, and Annabelle's pointed it out, as what's most critical is in applying these systems thinking into these scenarios. So they don't exist in isolation. There's a multitude of different integrated parts around consequences of decision making and influences on them. I think there are choices to make on what we do, where we invest, what we stop doing. I suppose I think and it's something that is prevalent. And you've seen increasing commentary across the country at the moment, and what we don't have and a missing piece for all of these processes is clarity on what are the social, economic, and environmental outcomes we're striving for as Aotearoa. What's our place? What's the North Star sort of thing? Because I suppose without this sort of vision or aspiration, we run the risk of making decisions, policy decisions, and huge investments in time and money without clarity of what we're trying to achieve. And there's a real opportunity to hone that a bit more, I think, to maximise our economic outcomes, our competitive advantage, and ultimately our quality of life.
Yeah, no, well said, John. Energy absolutely interfaces with every part of our society, and so those knock-on consequences are undeniable. And Annabelle, coming to you, given that, why are specific projections for economic metrics like GDP not included in the report?
The reason for that is that the scenarios that we develop by their very nature, they have really long time horizons, and those time horizons don't align well with traditional economic modelling. So our medium-term time horizon is out to 2050, which is well beyond the long term for most current economic models around. So that's certainly the first and the most obvious reason. Secondly, GDP projections are often less certain than temperature projections for a given emissions pathway. And we don't want to be in a situation of overstating confidence in projections by providing precise numbers, because we're all creatures of habit where we hone in on the precise numbers. And as much as possible, if we don't have that there, it removes the idea that we're pinning our hopes on a particular number. The other thing is that the reality is that linking physical climate impacts to economic losses is also not particularly mature practice globally yet. So the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, they produce scenarios that are commonly used in the financial sector, and they have improved their methods recently to include some acute climate impacts, but they're still not accounting for things like sea level rise and ocean acidification and extreme weather events and so on and so forth. So there's not a good alignment yet. Right. What we've done in the report instead is tried to focus on the themes and the qualitative statements around economic indicators, to really focus on risks and strategy, rather than litigating the exact numbers. So what we ask is that when you read the report, try not to focus too much on the numbers or the finer details, but on the broader challenges and the themes that are being discussed, because that's probably going to be more useful.
That makes, yeah, look, that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense, Annabelle. Thank you. And just a reminder, we've got some questions coming through in the Q&A, which is fantastic. So please, everyone, continue to send those through. We've got a team that are monitoring them, and we'll ask as many of those as we can toward the end. So Tina, coming to you, and then coming to you, Callum, with the same question. Look, we're very lucky in New Zealand. We've got a lot of options in the renewable space, but we're also really vulnerable because of distance. So what do you see as our key vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two thoughts that come to mind for me. I guess one is we are dependent on access to technology offshore and componentry to deliver what we need to decarbonise New Zealand. And so I think being really focused and aligned on where we're headed, so our net zero 2050 target as a country, and making sure the likes of our suppliers know that we're committed and that there's like strong demand for that here. I think that's really important, and it's something that we need to be very focused on in the short term. I think the good news is, I guess, we have been partially to fully reliant on kind of imported liquid fuels for a long time. And so, as we grow more renewables locally, that is a very clear opportunity to displace kind of imported energy, and the kind of opportunities that the scenarios are pointing to kind of illustrate that. So I think that's a good news story, and over time kind of a win-win for reducing vulnerability and that dependency on others over time.
Thanks, Tina. Callum, your thoughts?
I certainly agree with Tina on those points. Access to expertise jumps out. So already New Zealand has a shortfall of about 500 engineers a year. And in STEM fields generally, we're not training enough people. We're already reliant on getting overseas people in, and that's got some benefits, but that's going to become increasingly more and more difficult. Likes of the Inflation Reduction Act, what we've seen in Australia recently with their Made in Australia policies, all of that's going to kick off an awful lot more investment in those sectors and create a lot more competition for the skilled personnel needed to deliver those projects. The other vulnerability that jumps out is kind of our low density. So, low population compared to the amount of land, certainly compared to our coastline. We've got a lot of kilometres of infrastructure per person. So all these things really do conspire to make our adaptation challenges a lot more expensive on a per person basis. And it does mean that some of the best technologies that will scale overseas might not necessarily work well in a New Zealand environment with our low density. Yeah.
Interesting. So John, coming to you, how exposed is the sector to technological and market developments overseas?
Oh, very. A couple of reasons. Generally a technology follower, not broadly an energy early adopter. And we typically wait for others to learn lessons before we pick up, let others make mistakes. We're also not a big market, as the others have said, which means unless we can sort of go all in or provide some certainty that we've got some scale, it's pretty hard to provide sufficient enough pipeline for suppliers to be interested. We're seeing it's a global market. It's rapidly increasing across the globe. We're on the back foot when it comes to access to technology supply chains, particularly to fuel the transition. Larger markets are rapidly taking up market capacity, and particularly North America. Australia is rapidly responding in its own way as well, where it's looking to build more resilience to international trends and to I suppose more than offset its reduced GDP through I think it's 280 billion in fossil fuels at the moment. They're looking to try and transition and become a net exporter of energy and energy-related materials, energy-related technologies. So they're rapidly increasing, which potentially provides an opportunity for us. They're leaning into Japan and South Korea in terms of technology agreements. They're our trading partners, so perhaps there's an opportunity there for us to look at how we can partner and benefit from that proximity. I think also from a technology perspective, I know there's quite a lot of work there, but happening at the moment. But there's probably more we can do and untapped potential and need to look at investment and energy efficiency measures. There's a lot of focus on building supply and distribution, and I know that EECA and others are doing quite a lot in the energy efficiency space, but perhaps it's not as visible, and the uptake isn't as great as it could be to help our resilience, I suppose.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, John. Now, look, I'd like to go to a question from our Q&A, Annabelle, that we've had come through. Someone's asked, I'm curious about the different 2050 population numbers of the different scenarios. Are these migration driven?
Yes, short answer is yes, that's what's driving that. So those population numbers are coming from Stats New Zealand, and they're based on migration forecasts and birth rates, essentially, is where those numbers come from.
Right.
They're also the numbers that the Climate Change Commission uses in their work as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And staying with you, thinking about the scenarios, how do these scenarios align with the updated, downscaled climate change projections that are expected from NIWA later this year?
Okay, yeah. Well, as many of you will know, NIWA has new data sets coming out later this year. Of course, later this year is not now. And so this report has relied on and referenced existing NIWA climate data sets. When the new data sets are released, they're going to help organizations to get more detailed projections at an asset level, among other things, which is incredibly helpful for organizations. It's not necessarily as useful at a sector level, though. And so we're quite comfortable that, of course, there will be new and better information coming, but at this point in time, while they don't align perfectly, that's not a problem. In terms of the new projections, we understand that they're going to be based on 3 emissions pathways, and the 2 highest pathways will align pretty nicely with the 2 warmest scenarios in our work, so hothouse and slow followers. And the 3rd pathway falls quite neatly in between the 2 coolest scenarios, so trailblazers and coordinated effort.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Annabelle. Tina, coming to you. How would you use this report if you're a business looking to undergo scenario analysis yourself?
Well, a couple of thoughts. So one, if you are new to this, I'm going to echo what James said at the beginning. This is actually a really educational document. It wasn't that long ago where you would have to read a raft of different things and do the brain gymnastics to try and make sense of it all. So it's a really good educational resource that kind of explains a lot of kind of the acronyms that he kind of pointed to. The other thing I'd say is if you are planning to do entity scenarios but haven't done so yet, this is a really great place to take a quick leap forward. I think looking at the detail of the scenarios to cascade or take the parts of that are most relevant for your organization is really interesting, and also looking at the risks and opportunities that have been identified. Some or all of those might be relevant, or certain parts of that. So I think pulling out your entity specific impacts from the scenarios and the risks and opportunities is good. If you're someone like us who has done entity scenarios and risks assessments, I think it's a useful document to kind of stress test the quality of the work that you've done so far. So are there aspects or details that have come out of this work that could improve your assessments of what you've done to date? I think the other piece is referencing those. I think, as James alluded to at the beginning, really kind of helps users of these reports to kind of easily kind of compare outputs across organizations. So that's what I would say.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Tina. John, I've got one from the Q&A here that I'd like to ask you. See if you're up for answering it. So, do the scenarios help us think about the
energy efficiency in action?
Do the scenarios help us think about the difficult questions facing the sector, e.g., whether to invest in bioenergy, hydrogen in a big way, whether expand coal, oil, and gas production?
Yeah, I think they do, but I suppose you've got to, as Tina says, you've got to apply an enterprise level view on what is you're trying to achieve. I think the challenge that we have at the moment is certainty around demand as well. You know, the recent decisions, you know, down the deep south has helped firm up, I suppose, some investment decisions around the system and you know, firming up Tiwai, but we're still not seeing a huge uptake, and others will know better than me in relation to, you know, pressure on increased demand, particularly for industry. And I think, you know, there's a real, this is what I was saying, the North Star, there's a real opportunity to make the most of the investment in the energy transition, as well as, you know, other infrastructure. We're looking at $1 trillion over the next 30 years, or, you know, even whether it's $500 million, it's a big number. You know, how do we create demand which is going to create value? And if you're creating value, then you can look at, well, you know, firming up some of the decisions around investment in different technologies. I think the other thing, you know, technology is changing so rapidly. We've got to have an eye on you know, how is it driving efficiencies and lowering cost. As Callum said, you know, the cost of transition is quite high, and this is where I go, unless we can understand how do we create more value. Because if we can create more value, it's increasing our economic and GDP outcomes and productivity. So at an enterprise level, I think, you know, you've got to look at, well, you know, and we're seeing that from some clients actually taking stock of, is the business that they're in now the business they're going to be in the 5-10 year horizon, and what does, say, energy transition mean for them in terms of their resilience. And, you know, you've got geopolitical and international regulations increasingly around export and what you can and can't export to other markets as well. So there's a multitude of different, I suppose, influences on decisions around, you know, what energy you might invest in, you know, the return on investment time frame, and the consequences of making those investments and how sustainable they are. That's
brilliant. Great answer. Thank you. Thank you, John. Look, I've got one last question for Callum, then Tina, then Annabelle. If you could change one thing tomorrow about the energy sector, what would it be? Callum?
I think it would probably be an understanding issue. So when I look back at the history of how the energy sector has performed, I think I've got quite a different perspective on that from, say, the general public and folks outside of the energy sector. I have quite a positive view of how the energy sector has performed, both gas and electricity, and has performed well in terms of that energy trilemma that has been mentioned. I think there is a tendency to catastrophize what happens. So especially when the reliability space, when something does go wrong, that tends to get painted as a crisis. So certainly not a perfect sector, but has really performed very well. I think there's definitely lessons in there for other infrastructures in New Zealand, that the kind of this consumer funded, you know, relatively subsidy free, moderate sort of regulation, market led approach has had genuine success.
Thanks, Callum. And Tina and Annabelle, I'm going to have to apologise. I'm being told I've run out of time, so we're not going to be able to ask that final question of you each. So Callum gets the final word. Look, I'm going to have to wrap up and say a huge thank you to our panel and other speakers today. Thank you very much for being here and making yourselves available to inform everyone on this great piece of work. Once again, I want to acknowledge Annabelle, James, Hunter, Phoebe, and all the team at PwC who brought this report to fruition. Thank you to all our speakers for all your views, for sharing your expertise. We do hope this report is useful. That's why we do the work at The Circle, because we want to help your sector and others prepare for the future and think about the issues that we face around climate change and resilience. The report's on our website. Please do take a look. There's a link in the chat. Ngā mihi nui, and have a great rest of your day.